Chapter 3: The Conversion of War Bonds into Bank Credit. The demand in 1. For the conversion of war bond certificates, etc., into legal tender has on numerous occasions been met with objection. It's been met with the objection that it would mean excessively flooding the market with currency. This objection is in itself quite erroneous. Inflation occurs through the mere existence of a war bond. It is, however, true that, in spite of its wrong-headedness, the concern about the physical presence of these papers declared to be currency is not going away. And therefore, despite being unrealistic, this concern might generate unfortunate side effects, as if, in fact, a new inflation had taken place. Therefore, amending 1, we demand, after legislative cancellation of the obligation to pay interest, conversion of war bond certificates, along with other public debenture bonds, not in currency, but into bank credit. This formulation has the great advantage that the physical existence of war bonds as paper would cease. The war bond certificates would be delivered to the Reichsbank by banks, bankers, thrift institutions, etc., and would be destroyed after a credit note for the face value is issued. Therewith, nearly every person in Germany would receive a bank credit, an open bank account that he could use. Such a procedure would also have the great advantage that the retention of larger investments in private possession would not be possible, since after the expiration of a specified deadline, the undelivered certificates would be declared void. Furthermore, it would at least be possible to control how many war bond is spent outside the country, thus affecting Germany's trade balance. The last point, however, must not in any way block fulfillment of the abolition of the enslavement to interest, since we really feel too weak compared to foreign countries. We must satisfy only the interest demands that confront us from abroad. Personally, I am entirely of the opinion that we should also uphold the cancellation of interest even for foreign bondholders. We not need fear that foreign interest claims will be enforced by force of arms, since there has been so much progress in returning from war madness to something resembling self-awareness. And never yet in history has a warlike action been undertaken against a great state because of financial measures affecting private persons. It also ought not to be imagined that even the French people would issue an ultimatum to Germany because of the interest claims of Messrs. Meyer, Schultz, and Cohen from Germany, based on their German war bonds carried across the border. Beyond that, it would be possible, so as to avoid even the appearance to the rest of the world of a state bankruptcy, to conduct a lottery of the war bond, which then, of course, could easily be rigged based on statistics obtained through the required delivery of certificates, so that at first just the numbers, presumably belonging to people abroad, would be drawn and paid off in Reich banknotes. Yet a third thing would be the welcome ascertainment of the distribution of war bonds and the accompanying opportunity that still exists for an extraordinarily simple collection of the wealth tax. Well, the bursaries, of course, would need only to instruct the Reichsbank offices to charge the account of Mr. N.N. with so and so many marks in tax. In this manner, tax payments would be more painless by far, although, of course, the taxpayer's right of appeal would continue to exist in its full extent. With such a transformation, conversion of war bonds into bank credits, a certain social leveling could also be accomplished insofar as smaller investments in war bonds, thus all small subscriptions of all those for whom the subscription of war bonds really is to be accounted a patriotic deed, let us say up to 5 or 10,000 marks, would be made good at par, while all larger subscriptions could be credited at a rate to be established. The credits for all other government paper would be handled precisely the same. 4. Special comments on the demand for laws in the Manifesto. On 1, it is completely indispensable that all state and municipal debt subscriptions be treated in the same way, since only such a unitary large-scale regulation of our entire monetary system, hand in hand with the abolition of interest slavery, can be implemented. On 2, it is already clear that the abolition of interest slavery must be applied simultaneously to all the other fixed interest papers so as not to cause an absurd boom in these papers, which obviously would occur if the public papers alone were declared interest-free. The reduction of the debt, as such, would be accomplished through annual repayment, whereby a constant and consistent undebting of all debt-laden objects would be accomplished. This paragraph is very closely related on 3. This paragraph is very closely related to the preceding ones, as well as with the demand for nationalization of mortgages lending in 5. The farmer or homeowner burdened with mortgages continues after, as before, to pay the amount that he had to pay to his creditors, but no longer in eternal interest, rather as a repayment. Thus, after 20, 25, or 30 years, depending on the pre-existing interest rate, ownership of land and home will be freed from debt. The mortgage bank, for its part, can naturally likewise only during this time continue correspondingly to pay interest on covered bonds to covered bondholders. Hand in hand with this liberation from debt arises the community's right of ownership in the real estate freed from mortgages. A universal registry of dwellings, or rather a real estate cadaster, would have to come first, because debt-free real estate ownership naturally also has the right to repayment of invested capital, and also a permanent claim on a portion of the rent to pay all the charges, expenses, and so on that come with real estate ownership, as well as appropriate compensation for work that the owner himself does. The connection between the registry of dwellings and the rights of debt-free owners is puzzling, unless the idea is to manage the growth of rental property so as to keep it reasonably profitable. Let us consider this in broad outlines, with the example of an urban apartment house. The house has a value of 100,000 marks. Against that is recorded a mortgages bank investment of 50,000 marks at 4% in position 1, a non-corporate investment of 20,000 marks at 5% in position 2, 3,000 marks is the amount put up by the house owner himself. The revenues from rent are 7,000 marks. From this must be paid 2,000 marks for the first mortgage, 1,000 marks for the second mortgage, and 1,000 marks for expenses, outlays, and so on. In all, 4,000 marks. Thus, 3,000 marks remain to the house proprietor as an interest payment, so to speak, for his own invested capital of 30,000 marks. Following implementation of the legal abolition of interest on money, the situation after 10 years is as follows. First mortgage, 30,000 marks. Second mortgage, 10,000 marks. The house owner has completely recovered his capital investment. But on the other hand, there is a new public right of ownership in the amount of 50,000 marks. With that, the right of the state to have a say about further income does not state how he derives the figures of 50,000 marks. It is half the value of the apartment house, but also equal to the amount of the corporate mortgage. Probably the most important fact is that it is not more than the amount owed in mortgages, and therefore causes no pain to the house owner. Presumably, given the emphasis that Fetter puts on painless transition, if the amount owed on the house were less than half the value, the state, according to Fetter's plan, would still not claim a share of ownership greater than what it is owed in mortgages. It would be unjust now in regard to repayment to put the house proprietor on the same level as mortgages, for his capital is not pure loan capital in the narrower sense that should be affected by abolition of interest slavery. Here we are talking about risk capital, specifically about money converted into valuable good, specifically a house. It is therefore up to the owner of the house whether to grant a longer duration of payments or a corresponding percentage permanently included in the operating expenses of the house. It cannot be the purpose here to make any binding proposals. Here only suggestions are being made as to how a frictionless transition of the interests economy into the interest-free economy could occur even in the area of real estate. So as to complete the example, let the status after 25 years be presumed as follows. By the time all mortgages are paid off, only the permanent expenses are the same, or, because of the greater age of the house, increased from 1,000 marks to perhaps 1,500 marks. Let the return afforded to the house proprietor from this sum also be about 1,000 to 1,500 marks. Thus, accordingly, it appears that around 3,000 marks of the rent revenues go to cover non-negotiable charges, while the remaining 4,000 of the original 7,000 in rent revenues will be freely disposable. The state thus has the possibility of lowering the rents by more than half. It will do this, e.g., in workers' dwellings, or the state may cut rents by only 20, 30, or 40%, and thus gain from the difference an enormous source of revenue for other public necessities. Above all, naturally, for publicly conducted home construction. For mansions, the rents are not lowered, or not lowered much, whence very great additional means become available, also for the better construction of homes or for special social purposes. This future state of affairs, however, reveals, and I hold this for a very fruitful prospect, the inner justification for the community state, even now, to take part in determining the amount of rent in the manner that I sketched above, with a lowering of rent for workers' dwellings. In the growing right of the state to participate in real estate ownership also lies in the foundation for a sound bank of issue, an issue of credit to mortgage creditors. On 4 and 5. These paragraphs demand the socialization of the entire monetary system. Money is only and exclusively a voucher for completed labor, issued by a community that has its own state. To issue money tokens is one of the sovereign, fundamental rights of the state. The counterfeiting of the state's money tokens is subject to the most severe punishments. Thus, it is quite forceful social demand that the monetary system be placed under the control of the collectivity. The work power of the collectivity is the sole substrate of money tokens, and only the failure to appreciate this fundamental fact has led in general to the deterioration of our public finances, the complete anarchy of the monetary system in general. With the surrender of personal and commercial credit by private bankers, proposed in 5, a deeper incision is made into the total credit system. For the state credit system, as well as for municipal and even real estate credit, one must cleave to the abolition of interest slavery with utmost rigor and energy, because it is the indispensable prerequisite for the social state in general. The situation is different with personal credit. We also demand in and for itself the interestlessness of personal credit, yet this demand does not carry the same enormous and principal importance. We remember the $250 billion of fixed interest loan capital compared to the only $12 billion in dividend-paying stocks. All such credits, stocks, participation certificates, mining shares, equity holdings, and so on, are risk capital. The yield of this capital depends on the industry and efficiency of those persons to whom the money was entrusted. Here the element of risk and danger of loss thus comes into play, along with the question of personal trust. For that, a certain compensation of a special kind still appears indispensable. The owner of stocks and so on is in no way compensated for or benefited if the enterprise to which he entrusted his money earns nothing. He loses his money entirely if the enterprise collapses. It is otherwise with, for example, the owner of Devonshire bonds of the Reichseisenbahn, the Reichsrailroads, and Alsace-Lothringen are completely lost with the loss of Elsass-Lothringen. Nonetheless, the holder of railroad bonds continues to receive his interest payments from whom? From the taxes of the collectivity. The railroads may work with the deficit balance of any magnitude, as in Prussia and Bavaria in the last year. Yet the bondholders receive their interest payments just the same. From whom? from tribute paid out of the work potential and consumption of the working population. One would just like to make this fundamental distinction perfectly clear, in order finally to recognize where it is that the vampire sucks from the work potential of the people. Thus, personal credit should remain, or rather be allocated again, to personal dealing through the private bank. The personal efficiency of the credit seeker, with which the banker is personally familiar, should again become the determining factor for personal credit. The fees set by the state will regulate themselves by themselves, in accord with the fluidity of money that will in any case commence with the abolition of interest slavery. The main point of 5, this is on 6, of 5, is also valid for dividend assets. In particular, in the interest of the social state community, it must be demanded that a repayment of the capital once lent be attempted also for the great industrial enterprises, in order to bring about here, too, a reduction of the indebtedness of the individual industrial workers, a reduction of the indebtedness of the individual industrial works toward those that are only investors. For in fact, what we are able to observe in the relationship of loan capital towards all peoples repeats itself here on a smaller scale. Here, too, the capitalist exploits the worker, the foreman, the engineer, the entrepreneur, all equally, because the compulsion to earn dividends takes priority. This is a problem of joint stock companies, companies owned free and clear by families, as is common in Germany, do not have this characteristic. If, however, we attest the liberation of industries and businesses from the eternal interest sucker, then the way is clear for the lowering of prices of products and for the delivery and distribution of surplus value, partly to the community, partly to the laborers, middle management, and boards of directors of the particular enterprises, thus to those that really alone can create manufacturing and values. On 7. In this paragraph, naturally the entire field of insurance also comes into play, which can be constructed on an analogous interest-free basis. The premiums paid cannot grow through addition of interest. Rather, the insurance companies will become thrift institutions. In other words, the risk and advantage of insurance are retained. For this, the political community has to be responsible. With regard to the devaluation of our money, which has resulted only through the enormous mass of our innumerable certificates of indebtedness, we demand a strongly graduated wealth tax. We lay the emphasis in this on strongly graduated. A flat wealth tax for the purpose of reduction of the number of notes and so forth would be nothing but a self-deception, whereby one throws sand into the eyes of the people. For if I also confiscate half of all the wealth everywhere and receive payment in bonds and pulp these, all that is really accomplished thereby is a diminution of the amount of paper. In return, a conversion factor will increase the fictive value and the totality of circulating paper to the same level as before. Real value belongs always only to goods for consumption and goods for use, never to the paper vouchers for completed labor. Another question is whether the foreign exchange rate of our mark currency can be improved. But even this improvement of the exchange rate is again, in the final analysis, only dependent on the work potential and production. In other words, the possibility for production of our total national economy. Chapter 5, the objections and their refutation. Never yet has an idea been able to establish itself without opposition, least of all an idea that makes such a radical departure from long-established assumptions about the sanctity and inviolability of interest. With the objections already raised and those expected, there is always a twofold observation to be made. It must be asked, first, What part of the objections being made is based on deliberate distortion of the idea of abolition of interest slavery? And second, what ought to be said in response to all sincere and fact-based misgivings? The most frequent objection is the assertion, without the charging of interest, nobody will lend money. We do not in fact want anyone to lend his money anymore. Credit was the trick, was the trap into which our economy entered, and in which it is now helplessly ensnared. If the folk really urgently needs greater capital, then it gets the needed money interest-free at the central state treasury, with one repayment required. Eventually, it will issue new banknotes. Why should it issue interest-bearing certificates? Whether the paper bears interest or not makes no difference. Its only and sole backing is the work potential and tax potential of the folk. Why burden every public expenditure from the beginning with the leaden weight of eternal interest? Yes, but how should the state fulfill its cultural labors for the community? It still needs money and can be fair in this task only by way of loans that charge interest. This assertion is based on an entirely Mammonistic way of thinking. It would have to be deliberately calculated for misdirection after thorough reading of the Manifesto. For in the first place, we have proven that after the abolition of interest slavery, all cultural and social tasks of the state can be covered out of state-owned businesses, out of the revenues of the postal service, railroad, mines, forests, and so on, without anything further. It is in second place, the sovereign people's state, Volksstaat, that the power at any time to take care of spiritual has the power at any time to take care of spiritual cultural tasks through the issue of interest-free value tokens in lieu of the interest-bearing certificates declared to be the rule in the Mammonistic state. It is thoroughly impossible to see why the state should make special cultural tasks, e.g. railroad, canal, and hydroelectric construction, more costly for itself, with an eternal promise of interest that is completely unnecessary, if it cannot pay the costs of construction from the revenues of its current state-owned businesses. Then there is no reason to see why the state should not create the money. The sovereign people must indeed pay for it. Will it recognize precisely this money as a means of payment? Why, however, should the folk with its entire work and tax potential stand behind another slip of paper, the interest-bearing loan, which imposes on the folk in its totality only an eternal interest obligation for the benefit of the capitalist? Therefore, away with this obsession of the Mammonistic state. The capitalists then will just take up the issued paper notes and accumulate paper money. This is refuted in two ways. First, the demand that mere possession of money should be rendered unprofitable would then, of course, be already fulfilled, and the abolition of interest slavery voluntarily undertaken by the capitalists themselves, since the capitalist renounces interest of his own accord, if he piles up his paper notes at home. Second, the capitalist's fear for his money makes it unlikely. One need only imagine the sleepless nights of the currency hoarder who keeps great sums of money piled up at home and must constantly see his possessions threatened by thieves, robbers, burglars, house searches, fire, and flood. I am convinced that the upright citizen would become tired of these worries in a short time and would soon find his way to the state bank. The state bank issues a receipt and is now legally responsible for the account, but not for any interest payments. Otherwise, of course, a third possibility still remains open to everyone, specifically to work with his money, to create values and to manufacture goods, to participate in industrial undertakings, to render his life ever richer and finer, to support art and scholarship. In short, to make beneficial use of his money while rejecting the cult of Mammon. It can, however, still happen that private need of capital for some goals urgently presents itself, e.g. for testing of inventions, founding of businesses by young, competent craftsmen or businessmen, etc. To begin with, this has nothing whatsoever to do with the abolition of interest slavery, for in the first place, one must logically assume that the capitalist who, after the abolition of interslavery, of course, has no more opportunity to invest his money in a bomb-proof manner and to expect idle consumption of interest, will rather, as in an earlier age, be inclined to risk his money for such purposes, so that a lack or need in this direction will therefore occur much less than hitherto. Or, has one not heard, on the contrary, again and again from the efficient business people, from the cleverest inventors, precisely the complaint of how difficult it is to get money in the Mammonistic state for such purposes unless a dividend could be guaranteed? In the second place, it must be the task of the coming state to foster every competent force through generous support. There were indeed, even before now, already beginnings toward this in the old bureaucratic state, but so small-hearted that instead of a stimulus, an inhibition and reluctance resulted, because of the harassing regulations that accompanied the granting of public support. In the third place, let it be noted that with the allocation of several million marks, enormously much could be achieved. The joy of labor, the industriousness and tenacity of the German inventor, engineer, craftsman, etc., is so great that although the state's right of participation in the results of fortunate inventions, the expenditures most likely would be richly rewarded. England as an example. The abolition of interest slavery leads necessarily to the exhaustion of wealth. Oh, ho, who claims that? Who claims that? But of course, whoever has adapted his life to the consumption of his interest payments on capital and cannot resolve to work, with him it is certainly true. Consuming 5% annually, he will have completely exhausted his wealth in 20 years. Of course, but that is indeed completely in order. What we want is precisely the abolition of interest slavery. We want living on a pension to cease, being the citizen's highest ideal. We want to end this mammonistic decadence. Indeed, we want no longer to tolerate that many can live in comfort permanently only from interest payments on loans. In other words, at the expense of others. I repeat, it is also not true at all that the abolition of the lordship of interest would lead to the elimination and exhaustion of wealth. On the contrary, the abolition of interest slavery would promote the creation of wealth, based on labor that manufactures goods and produces value, unburdened and liberated from eternal interest outlays. The abolition of interest slavery leads, as we have seen, to a comprehensive lowering of costs in all life. It unburdens us from the excessive weight of taxation, so that for every working man the possibility of accumulating savings must be greater in the future than hitherto. One more thing. The goods and values producing national economic labor for industry, commerce, and trade is in no way hindered, but fostered to the utmost through the abolition of interest slavery. What does the worker get if capitalists receive no more interest payments? This question really ought not to be coming up anymore. In the first place, of course, it was the constant battle cry of labor that the capitalists would exploit the workers. In the second place, we have indeed clearly and plainly seen that it is the laborer, more than anyone else, that is required to pay the interest on loans. In other words, what the worker gets is lower taxes and the lower cost of living. The bonds of family are weakened and damaged if one can leave no wealth behind for his children. Yes, what is the reality here? Quite generally, I think that money has little or nothing to do with the sense of family. Or has one heard that the children of wealthier parents cleave to their parents more than those of poor parents? Or do rich parents love their children more than the less propertied? What is likely to be more important for the children? That their parents arrange for them the best possible upbringing and have them learn some discipline, raising them into industrious and healthy and courageous people, or that they leave behind for them the biggest possible money bag. In particular cases, a justified striving to secure the children's financial future undoubtedly will have to be acknowledged. This striving, and thus the thriftiness of the parents for their children, will be in no way adversely affected by the abolition of interest slavery. On the contrary, the possibility of saving will become greater when our national economy will be liberated from the all-encompassing pressure of interest slavery. We have seen from the example that the man with earnings of 10,000 marks and pension income of 5,000 marks, that all medium-sized and smaller fortunes are in fact robbed of any beneficial effect by the circuitous route of the direct and indirect taxes of housing rent, and so on. I cannot repeat often enough, interest on bonds for possessors of small and medium amounts of wealth is a swindle, a self-deception, a running around in circles. But big capital, through its devoted press, has quite diabolically propagated and proclaimed in all the world that the faith in the sanctity and inviolability of interest, it allows everyone seemingly to take part in the lovely anesthetizing consumption of interest in order to lull to sleep the bad conscience that must invariably accompany idle, laborless consumption of interest, and in order to recruit comrades for the struggle for the defense of this highest good of Mammonism. The civil servant, the statesman, will say, the state cannot renounce the obligation that it has undertaken toward its creditors. What does obligations mean? Is it in any way moral to enter into obligations about which the state must know from the beginning that it can only fulfill these obligations if it takes the interest away from the creditors through direct and indirect taxes in precisely the same amount? Where is the morality in that? Or is it not perhaps more honest to admit I can only pay the interest if I collect just as much in taxes? But back during the war, I absolutely had to have money, and for that I did the swindle with the war bond. You have to forgive me, beloved folk. It was ultimately for you, and now we want to play no more hide and seek. I, the state, am paying no interest, and you, the taxpayer, need not pay taxes for the interest. That will substantially simplify our transactions. Thus we shall do without the enormous tax bureaucracy, and likewise the extraordinary interest-serving bureaucracy. Right? Do we have a deal? And you, Herr Scheiderman, do not again post your name on every advertising pillar as the Secretary of State of the old compromised government amid foolish declarations relating to the security and inviolability of the war bond. You only embarrass yourself. The benefit of the entire swindle has indeed gone only and solely to big loan capital. Financial officials and banking professionals are declaring that the abolition of enslavement to interest on war bonds and public debts is impossible because it's synonymous with public bankruptcy. You will forgive me, according to your speeches, we are indeed publicly bankrupt anyway, or must become so. An overt declaration of your public bankruptcy, however, would be the greatest stupidity that we could commit to the actual incompetence of the current power holders. It would add prematurely to the historical confirmation of this incompetence. Why declare bankruptcy? If I have put 3 marks from the right pants pocket into the left, I must still not on that account declare the bankruptcy of the right pants pocket. But it was indeed no different with the war loan. The Reich took out of the people's pockets the first actually present billions. Then the monies flowed back again. Then came the new loan. And again the money streamed back again. Once again came the pump and sucked the billions, and again they ebbed back, until after the game had been repeated 9 times, the state had merely generated 100 billion in debt. For that the people had 100 billion in finely printed paper in their hands. At first the folk imagined that it had become so much richer. Then came the state and said, it is horrible. I have 100 billion in debt and face bankruptcy. Yes, but why? That is, in any case, only a self-deception. I myself can indeed never become bankrupt if every so often I take my money from the one pocket and place it in the other. Therefore, we cannot rest at ease about state bankruptcy in regard to our internal war bond debts. Therefore, we really need not declare public bankruptcy, and we can really spare ourselves the gigantic labor with the stupid interest payments and the big, but even stupider taxes. Let us indeed finally free ourselves from doing the bidding of big loan capital. Only big loan capital benefits from this loan interest tax swindle, since a lovelier lump of gold is left over for it, and the laboring folk pays this surplus in the form of indirect taxes. Meanwhile, however, the small and middle-sized capitalist simply chases his own tail. The global economic official says, the abolition of interest slavery is not possible for us to accomplish in Germany alone. It must be done internationally. Otherwise, we shall lose all credit, capital will flow away, and we will still have to fulfill our interest obligations toward the rest of the world. I confess that I myself was at a loss about this question for the longest time. It is the most difficult question because it involves our relationship with the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the matter has two sides. On the one hand, the idea of the abolition of interest slavery is the battle cry of all productive peoples against international enslavement to interest on money. On the other hand, it is the radical cure for our internal financial woe. But it is really no reason to refrain from using a cure just because the equally sick neighbor does not employ it at the same time. It would, however, be added stupidity if we in Germany continued to run in a crazy circle and pay taxes and interest when we have clearly recognized that this ridiculous activity benefits only the big capitalists and nobody else. Therefore, let us lead the way by our liberating example. Let us liberate ourselves from the enslavement to interest on money, and we shall soon see that the force of this victorious liberating idea will stimulate the peoples of the world to follow us. I am actually convinced that if this initiative is not suppressed by the German Mammonists, will sweep the other peoples along with irresistible necessity. The Spartacist says, the whole idea only amounts to a protection of capital. It still remains then as it was. The poor man is nothing and the rich remain. Yes, my friend, it is in general very hard to have a discussion with you. If you really are in the depths of your soul a communist, and will therefore actually maintain that all things belong to all men. Peter Kropotkin, The Conquest of Bread. And if, along with that, you are indeed familiar with the actual ideas of the great Bolshevik leaders in Russia, especially Lenin, and regard them as correct, and accordingly regard the next tasks of the Soviet Republic, designated by Lenin, universal tendering of accounts, and control of all production and distribution as humanly possible. If, however, you are completely clear about the fact that this task is only feasible, if at all, under a horrible tyranny, and you still remain at the bottom of your heart a convinced communist or Spartacist, and so on, then let us not dispute further with each other. We just do not understand each other and are speaking in different languages. And the future will decide either for the straitjacket state that can ultimately result from the chaos of Bolshevism, or the new state, for which I hope, with a national economy liberated from interest slavery. But if at the bottom of your communist heart, if you are honest, you find that you still think about it, you find that you still long for wife and child, for a human soul that stands closer to you than an Eskimo or a Zulu Kafir, if during factory labor commanded by the Soviet director, you think it would still be nice to possess your own little cottage, a little garden plot, if indeed, in the very depth of your soul, it would really give you no true satisfaction, that you should be entitled, like a dog on the street, to use every bitch that crosses your path. If you want to call somebody your wife, if you merely think about your saving something from your wage, which then should belong to you alone, then you are already no longer a communist. Then you have already in your heart broken from your so loudly proclaimed catchphrase, all things belong to all men. Then precisely what you do not want is that all things should belong to all men. You want that precisely which you wish for yourself. Wife, child, house, farm, savings. Whether you already have it or only hope to get it, even then should belong to you alone. And do you see, my friend, If you only suspect in your heart that it might make a difference to you if some random individual came and simply took all your savings away and took from you in the name of all, and if he brought another child for you and took with him yours, because all children belong to all, then, my friend, let us not continue to speak completely past each other. Perhaps I could ask you to contemplate whether, in fact, the communist message that all things should belong to all men would not necessarily mean the end of every culture, because the lack of any concept of ownership must, with compelling logic, force man down to the level of the beast. If all things belong to all men, if a tendering of accounts and control of all above ground production and distribution in linen cents could be coerced, then in the best case scenario, an ant colony would result. But in that case, we can also do without language, soul, and thought. Mutely, and then instinctively, we can perform our forced labor. The end of man is there. The end of man is from Ezekiel. There it means the purpose of man. But here it could have a double meaning, meaning man's purpose under communism becomes mindless slavery, which is the destruction of man. So the purpose and destruction. The end of man. But enough now, friend Spartacus. Let this fundamental consideration sink deeply into your head and heart. A more exact answer to your question will then result during conversation with other parties. And now, you comrades of the two socialist orientations, moderate and independent. Feder refers here to the Social Democratic Party and its pacifist offshoot, the Independent Social Democratic Party. I cannot imagine that serious contradiction or objections against the abolition of interest slavery would come from your side. And yet I must deal with you categorically, along with the entire socialist world of ideas, from Marx up to the current leaders, Ebert, Schneiderman, Kautsky, and so forth. 1. The socialist will, elevation in the working class, is an idea unconditionally bound to prevail. So far, we are in agreement. 2. The paths trodden for the attainment of this great goal are almost entirely wrong, because they, 3, are based on false assumptions. 4. The Marxist socialist idea of the state leads necessarily to communism, thus to decline. 5. Because however social democracy has a different goal, the elevation of the working class, of all working people in general, it faces a terrible inner conflict, because the logical consequences of Marxism lead to the direct opposition of the practical goal of the workers' movement. 6. From this inner division results the overt uncertainty in the direction of the government. 7. For the sake of the great practical goal, elevation of the working class, a sharper line must be drawn against Spartacus and Bolshevistic communism, and their methods must be combated with all our might. But social democracy, organized through labor unions, feels weak today before these radical groups, because it has taken up Marxist thinking as its fundamental principle of education, and because all Marxist ways of thinking logically lead to communism. Now the proof point two says the paths trodden by social democracy are almost entirely wrong. The whole agitation conducted throughout the country has led to a deep division within the population of our nation. The constantly repeated slanders against our employers of every kind, indeed of every bourgeois calling whatsoever as exploiters and bloodsuckers of the manual laborer working ostensibly and unassisted, have led to the unjustified embitterment and to the haughtiness of labor, which today necessarily finds its expression in the demand for the dictatorship of the proletariat, Communist Manifesto. The essential demand of the Erfurt program, the transfer of the means of production from private ownership to the ownership and operation of the community, has today been compressed into the cry for socialization. It is completely clear to every serious politician that full socialization of our economic ruin would mean complete state bankruptcy. But one dare not confess this openly and freely to the people. Not socialization, but desocialization would have to be the motto now. Thus one attempts to compensate the blatant miscarriage of every socialization through delusional tax projects and by this route to expropriate the expropriators for the second time. All of that means nothing other than abandoning the entire national economy to utter ruin. Instead of growth, a doubling of production, as the entire socialist literature for the period after the revolution promised, is out of the question. The exact opposite has occurred. The worst thing, however, would be if the current socialist government thought of accepting big foreign loans. With that, not only would our economic decline be sealed, but we would furthermore quite entirely deliver ourselves into interest slavery to the Entente, from which there would be no return. The fundamental failure, the basic error upon which this whole wrong chain of treaties demands the promises for the people has been constructed, is an entirely wrong attitude toward the industrial capital and loan capital. The Communist Manifesto, the Erfurt Program, Marx, Engels, Lassalle, Kautsky have not recognized the radical difference between industrial capital and loan capital. On this point, the entire social democracy must relearn. This fundamental error must be clearly recognized and frankly admitted without reservation. Then, however, one must also relentlessly draw the only possible conclusions. These, however, signify radical renunciation of the pointless, because completely mistaken, rage against industry and against the employer. Worker and work giver belong together. They have the same goal: work, production, for without production, without work, there can be no life, no culture, no forward, no upward. The self-evident and unavoidable oppositions that exist among humans, just because they are humans, are much less important than the great shared interests of the employer and employee. These oppositions are and have been resolvable by means of wage contracts and trade organizations to the mutual satisfaction of both sides. But let us not pursue further these questions that are trivial in the scope of our treatise on the largest political lines of force, and let us only emphasize that the interest of labor collectively is perfectly aligned with our national industry, with the national economy of our people. Whoever teaches otherwise and presents the oppositions between employer and employees as more important reveals himself as irresponsible and precisely in regard to the workers, for he thereby lays the axe to the roots of the tree that nourishes and supports the worker. Social democracy, however, has done that, and with that it has incurred eternal guilt before German labor. With that it has brought unspeakable misery upon our folk, because it cannot keep all its promises, because it cannot bring to us the peace of the mutual understanding, because it cannot create work for us, because it must even set up an armed force against us, because it cannot get by without the civil service, because it must demand the obligation to work, because the universal, equal, and direct suffrage for men and women over the age of 20 helps nobody to earn a living, because without the state's guarantee of the security of persons and property, chaotic circumstances must occur, because without integration and subordination of the individual into society, no vitality of the state is possible. Thus, a deep, despair-filled wave of disappointment passes through the entire people. If individuals still do not understand it, ministers, members of parliament, and people's delegates continue cheerfully lying to each other that the gains of the revolution must be defended against reaction. What these two terms mean, if anything, no sincere statesman would be able to tell the people clearly. The negative actions of the revolution, the deposing of a series of antiquated dynasties, deposing the officers, abolition of the nobility, dissolution of the army, in short, the great demolition, is indeed no gain. In reaction, the swept away, rotten doctrine of divine right does not have anywhere in the entire folk enough moral support to result in any forceful action. The bourgeoisie, as regards the real bourgeois, is much too cowardly, much too morally corrupt to rally against class-conscious labor. Therefore, it is not necessary for the ruling class of workers to be worried about a dynastic or bourgeois reaction. But the deep disappointment of the people about the so-called gains of the revolution, in other words, about the lack of any real improvement of the people's situation, that is the great danger. This disappointment leads to the streaming away of great masses ever farther to the left, where the promises already made are outbid by far. Ultimately, one can no longer make promises such as all things to all men. That is pure madness. But every idea, every phenomenon, every activity stretched and exaggerated to the extreme becomes madness in the end, and then changes into its opposite. So goes it, likewise with the communist ideas that all should belong to all. For this ultimately comes to an end and resolves into all having nothing. Hunger, despair, misery, sickness, and need have arrived in Russia. In Russia, people have lost the last remnant of courage in joy and living. I repeat, the enormous fundamental error in the socialist idea world is ultimately to be traced back to the failure to recognize the deep essential difference between industrial capital and loan capital. Interest devouring loan capital is the scourge of humanity. It is the eternal, effortless, and endless growth of big loan capital, not productive, goods manufacturing, industrial working capital that leads to the exploitation of peoples. I cannot forget here the examination of the question of why this essential difference has not been recognized, whether it really has not been recognized, or whether it perhaps has been obscured for the benefit of big loan capital, whether the leaders and chiefs of the struggle against capitalism, whether the authors of the Communist Manifesto, of the Erfurt Pogrom, and the current leaders always have proceeded with the necessary conscientiousness. It is the most grave and terrible thing when one casts doubt on the absolute earnestness and firm conviction of another. It seems all the more grave the more carefully one seeks after the causes and relationships pertaining to life's occurrences. I want therefore to give no answer at all to the question itself, rather only to allude to the big obscure connections by citing an utterance of Disraeli, the greatest English Prime Minister, Lord Beaconsfield. This he writes in his Endymion. No man will treat with indifference the principle of race. It is the key of history, and why history is often so confused is that it has been written by men who are ignorant of this principle and all the knowledge it involves. Baron Sergius the Endymion. The bourgeois. The bourgeois to whom rest appears as his bourgeois duty is certainly disturbed by every new revolutionary demand, as always with every new idea. It must unrest for him, for perhaps he would even have to think about something about it. All change is odious to him. He wants to have his rest, and woe unto him that covets his money bag. Now, indeed, one does want from him his interest payments, his income from rent on houses, the interest payments from his covered bonds, interest that he collects on mortgages. In short, what constitutes his rest, his contentment, and his good fortune. Even so, we must inquire what the members of the classes owning loan capital will have to say. They form, apart from the true bourgeois. Bourgeois is the human type with which nothing further is to be initiated. The bourgeois is a branch of the tree of humanity that should be lopped off, the sooner the better. These are the smug, self-satisfied babbits with their deplorably narrow horizons, who are capable of no enthusiasm. They while away their days in eternal monotony, with coffee, morning newspaper, morning drink, noon paper, lunch, afternoon nap, coupon clipping, afternoon drink, friends at the pub, and occasionally the movie house, lacking comprehension for all that moves the world, all for which youth longs, all that distresses the folk, the state, and society, untroubled about war and victory. They vegetate and decay, simultaneously arrogant and obsequious. But the bourgeoisie is such a broad class that it cannot be ignored. Thus, through the abolition of interslavery, thrift is destroyed. People end up in the poorhouse. That the abolition of interslavery quite generally may have its influence on thrift must be decisively denied. Thrift has just as little to do with the prevailing economic views as, e.g., wastefulness. Thrift and wastefulness are human qualities that either are present or not, indifferent to whether an age approves or frowns upon the idea of interest. In times of transition, perhaps an increase of diminution of thrift can be promoted. In the given case, however, I tend much more to the view that a rational, economically minded person will say to himself the following: I can no longer, in the future, count on living on my interest alone. I want, however, to live in later years and also still leave something behind for my children. Therefore, I must now save more. The abolition of interslavery must, in my opinion, exert this effect on the majority of people. As for the elderly, of course, they will be referred to public support. Here, too, I must once again stress emphatically that given the current burden of direct taxes on the property and the burden of indirect taxes on every lifestyle, nothing of the lovely interest payments remains except in the case of that person for whom, and it is indeed something from iniquity, nothing of the lovely interest payments remains except in the case of that person for whom, and it is indeed something iniquitous and to be combated, all income flows only from eternal interest payments. Therefore, a decline in thrift is probably not to be feared. Is loathsome big capital really so utterly unfruitful? Has it not also created the means to large-scale progress that bears fruits for humanity greater than what the interest on loan capital destroys? No. The posing of the question only proves that mammonistic phraseology has clouded our clear vision. Big capital has not created the means to large-scale progress. Rather, big capital has grown from labor. All capital is accumulated labor. Big capital is in itself unproductive, because plain money by itself is a thoroughly unfruitful thing. From mind, labor, and available or already developed raw materials or mineral resources, values are produced and goods are manufactured through labor and only through labor. For if one pours so much money onto the most fertile farmland, into the richest coastline, or into the richest coal mine, the farmland does not, on that account, bear grain, nor the coal mine spit out coal by itself. Let us conclusively affirm this. If people have invented money, it is accordingly quite useful and reasonable. For in every complex economy, one needs this universally recognized voucher for completed labor. But that a potential should inhere in these money empires to grow eternally from themselves into enormity, and money does that if it can bear interest, it is that against which the core of our being rebels. It is that which exalts money far above all other earthly manifestations. It is that which makes money into a kind of idol, into an idol. And all of that is indeed only the most enormous self-deception of humanity. Nothing at all can come from money alone. Table, cabinet, clothing, house, tool, in short, everything around us has some value. In the end, one can still use a broken piece of furniture as firewood to warm oneself. But with a 20-mark note, one cannot do anything. I cannot even wrap a piece of cheese in it. Only after people have sensibly agreed on the facilitation of the exchange of goods for consumption to write vouchers for completed labor, only with that, there's a slip of paper, does the The slip of paper received meaning and purpose, and it is very reasonable that the farmer for his grain receives from the coal mining company not coal but money. Thus a voucher for other completed labor, e.g. pitchforks, crockery, plow, and scythe, but with what the power of money but with that the power of money should end. Thus the large-scale progress of humanity has been made not by money, but by the men themselves. Their bold spirit, their proud daring, their clever mind, the strength of their hands, their shared, therefore, social industrious labor. So proudly and so clearly must we see. The men were the thing, certainly not the pitiful pieces of paper that men invented for the simplification of commerce. 6. Further program. Although the abolition of interest slavery is not the final goal of the new statecraft, it is truly the most incisive deed, the only deed that is able to unite all peoples into a true league of nations against the tyranny of Mammonism that accompanies all peoples. But it is not the end. On the contrary, the abolition of interest slavery must lead to further steps because, as we have seen, it lays hold of the global evil by the root, and indeed by the main root. Only when the ground-laying demand for the abolition of interest slavery is fulfilled is the path cleared for the first time ever for the social state. This must be clearly recognized, and it must be accomplished in spite of all mammonistic powers. The cry for socialization, while interest slavery persists, is nothing more than the attempt to bring about the formation of a trust of all industries and to create giant conglomerates everywhere, over which big loan capital, in spite of all wealth taxes, will naturally also have the deciding influence again in the future. A socialistic state on a mammonistic foundation is an absurdity and leads by nature to a compromise between social democracy, already strongly contaminated with mammonism big capital. We, by contrast, demand radical rejection of the mammonistic state and a reconstruction of the state according to the true spirit of socialism, in which the ruling basic idea is the obligation to nourish, in which the old basic demand of communism can find its rational and useful satisfaction, in the form that every member of the folk shall receive his assigned entitlement to the soil of the homeland, through the state's allocation of the most important foodstuffs. We further demand, as a skeleton for the new state, a representation of people through the Chamber of People's Representatives, which is to be elected on the broadest basis, and next year that a permanent chamber of labor, the central council in which the nation's workers have a voice in proportion to their distribution by profession and economic class. Finally, we demand the highest accountability for the directors of the state. This new construction of the state on a socialist aristocratic basis will be treated in an additional work that will appear soon from the same publisher. The prerequisite for all this construction, however, remains the abolition of interest slavery. My unshakable belief, nay more, my knowledge, makes me recognize clearly that the abolition of interest slavery is not only enforceable, but will and must be taken up everywhere with indescribable jubilation. Must be taken up everywhere with indescribable jubilation. For bear in mind, in contrast to all other ideas and movements and endeavors, however well intentioned, that aim at the improvement of mankind, my proposal does not want to try to improve human nature. Rather, it applies itself against a toxic substance, against a phenomenon that was artfully, no, diabolically invented, completely contrary to the deepest feeling of man, in order to make humanity ill, in order to ensnare humanity in materialism, in order to rob it from the best thing it has, the soul. Hand in hand, next to it goes the frightful, pitiless tyranny of the money powers, for which people are only interest slaves, exist only to work for the dividend for interest. People troubled, we recognize the frightful clarity and truth of the biblical proverbs, according to which the God of the Jews, Yahweh, promises to his chosen people, I want to grant to you to own all treasures of the world. At your feet shall lie all peoples of the earth, and you shall rule over them. This global question is now laid before all of you. Global questions are not solved with a wave of the hand, but the idea is clear as day, and the deed must be diligently propagated. We must understand clearly that we face the most formidable enemy, the world-encompassing money powers. All force on the other side, all on our side. Only justice. All force on the other side. On our side, only justice, the eternal justice of productive labor. Extend your hands to me. Working people of all countries, unite. Publishers afterward. While repetitive at times, this manifesto clearly stresses the importance of ending interest slavery. It presents some of the many benefits that would arise from such a radical departure of what we know as the norm. What most Americans are unaware of is how much emphasis the inwards place on uplifting the working class. This lack of awareness comes in spite of the NSDAP name, National Socialist German Workers' Party. Concern and struggle for the working class continues today, as does the movement to end profits without work, interest slavery. Such modern struggles have been far more successful in Europe than in the United States. Yeah, I don't know. These guys are promoting an American inward party. I don't think we need that. But I think this guy has some really good points. And we need to focus on them and redo our whole system. Because this financial system it's robbed all of us. And nobody has anything anymore. All across the world. Oh. Working peoples of all countries unite. I'm just going to sit back and let my money make money. Some money shouldn't make money. Money is a voucher for work, earned, not extorted, not manipulated, for work done, not for extortion. You shouldn't get more money for extortion than you get for work. Anyway, that's Gottfried Feder, and I feel that tiny mustache man kind of used him for a minute, and we got other ideas. And yeah, he went after his enemies, and like, what's that, Night of the Spears or whatever, where all of his enemies are killed, but I mean, Feder wasn't killed, but he wasn't. He was kind of just sidelined. All right. Anyway, that was good. Peace.